the Odyssey, the Iliad, Beowulf, Macbeth, and most recently, Graceling. Growing up in small town Vermont, he read constantly, drew comics for his high school newspaper, and painted a mural in the school hallway. Oh, hey, someone has made us appear. That's fantastic. I bet that was Jaina out there. So you should be able to appear now.
Yeah, I stopped sharing my screen and that allowed you to.
Okay.
Yeah, still no ability to turn on video. Also can't share screen right now. I mean,
I have some.
It's probably overkill, but you could make us both co-hosts. That might work.
You are not a co-host. I will co-host you. Or someone can co-host you. Let's see. I don't believe that'll do it.
I think maybe Gareth is popping back in.
Yes, I think he is. I think I changed his role.
I see a couple people have stated where they're from. So we have Michael from Providence and Ronell from Chicago.
Yes, and thank you for hanging out with us as we continue to troubleshoot. I know that both artists brought presentations to share, some slides to share, so hopefully they can do that in just a little while. But while we're doing a little more troubleshooting here, I'll finish the bios, and if nothing else, we can have a good conversation with this wonderful blank screen here. And please enjoy the comic shop background that I've got going on. I decided to make an homage to where I started reading. And I know that we've spent some time here, so I want to make sure everyone at least gets to hear the speakers, if not see them. It looks like Alexis has a really, really good avatar there. Some cool glasses. So I'll finish the bios and then continue to play with settings while we're talking. But so back to Gareth Hines. He graduated from Parsons School of Design, lucked into a job making computer games, and managed to draw and self-publish his first graphic novels on nights and weekends. And then Alexis Fajardo is an Eisner award-winning editor and cartoonist. Lex has created a unique blend of comedy, literature, and high adventure in his graphic novel series, Kid Beowulf. Lex is a member of the National Cartoonist Society, SCBW, has been a national writing juror for the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards. When he's not drawing comics, Lex works for them as an editorial director at the Charles M. Schultz Studio in Santa Rosa, California, where he edits Peanuts comic books and storybooks. In his free time, he enjoys fencing with swords and walking his dog and reading everything. So I'm going to keep playing with settings, but I'm curious if the two of you, do you know each other? Have you met before? And then we'll dive into some questions. Yeah. I was thinking you might have. And there again, I was thinking, like, in terms of adaptations, you two were the first people that I thought about reaching out to. So I think Gareth was going to kick things off with a presentation. So as soon as we can figure out how to screen share, we'll do that. But in terms of maybe guiding some questions first, maybe we can talk about that recurring appeal of historical classics. I'm a high school teacher and I negotiate that. Canon classics versus new canon, prose, graphic novel kind of world. So would either of you care to dive in and speak to sort of that recurring appeal of historical classics and what drew you to maybe bring these to life as graphic novels?
Sure. I mean, for me, I have always been fascinated by old stories, and I loved a bunch of the classics that I read in high school. And when I was, really starting to try to make more ambitious comics, I was often kind of running up against my own limitations as a writer. So initially it was a way to, kind of stand on the shoulders of giants and take, some of the greatest stories in existence, as proven over the course of time, and use those as materials so that I could really focus on the storytelling and the illustration. And then later on, it became clear to me that they were very valuable as educational tools. Having these classics as graphic novels, really was something that teachers and students wanted. And so I continued in that vein.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm just getting word that we might be able to screen share, but Lex, do you want to hop on that question first, and maybe we can try those settings out?
Yeah, no, I would just say for myself, I grew up reading Greek and Norse myths. It was just sort of injected into me at a very young age, all those myths and legends. So it was very formative. And so there was never a time I didn't really know about Theseus and Perseus and all the other us's, as they say. And even some of my very early comics were adaptations of those stories or riffs on them. So they very much lit my imagination when I was a kid. And so I think it's something I always sort of come back to. And of course, when I'm reading other comics and graphic novels that are not adaptations, I can see those threads from those other mythologies sort of seep through. And that's always exciting to see how others are inspired by just these classic stories. So it's something that is sort of, for me, like the oxygen I breathe. It's all around me. And so I can't imagine not playing with adaptations or these classics.
Yeah, just those stories that keep coming back. There's something that draws us to them. And so with drawing in mind, I would love for some folks out there to see your art and the presentations that I know you've spent time on. Are you able to screen share now?
Yeah, it looks like I can screen share. So I'll go ahead and try to do my little short presentation. Never fear, I'm going to keep this very short. Let us go here, and hopefully you can see a slide with my website.
Yes, that's good.
Okay, great. So what I thought I would do is actually, whoa, let's see, come on. There we go, advance. First of all, just show you, okay, these are a bunch of the classics that I have adapted into graphic novels. I've done, Beowulf, Edgar Allan Poe, a bunch of Shakespeare, but I'm best known for the Odyssey and the Iliad. And I'm going to use those as examples to talk about some of the kinds of decisions that I make when I'm adapting. I also recently adapted a contemporary fantasy novel called Graceling by Kristen Kishore. And I've also illustrated other kinds of books, including nonfiction like Samurai Rising, and picture books, also on the sort of Greek and Roman myth subject matter. So here's a couple of scenes that I think are instructive because they were really challenging for me in the Odyssey. And this is all towards the end of the book. So these are spoilers if anybody hasn't read the Odyssey, but I'm guessing most of this audience knows the basic story. So Odysseus returns home from the Trojan War, and he knows that there's a bunch of suitors who have kind of taken over his hall. And so he returns in disguise. Athena actually gives him a magical disguise so that nobody can see who he is. But there are a couple of characters who recognize him anyway. And the first one is his old nurse Eurycleia, and she recognizes him by this scar on his thigh. And in the original text, there's a whole long digression about how he got this scar. We sort of hear the whole story of this hunting trip, but it sort of literally transports you away from this scene. And what I found was that it was much better to simply suggest that entire sidebar by just doing this single image of him returning home from the hunt. So this is Eurycleia basically remembering him coming back from this hunt with the boar, with the wound on his leg. And that allowed me to stay in the action of this very tense moment where he stops her from revealing who he is. And that, by the way, is a classic example of a picture's worth 1,000 words. But there's other places where that is less true. And so one of the scenes that gave me trouble was the other character who recognizes him is his old dog, Argos, who's been waiting for him the whole time since he went away to Troy. It was just a puppy when he left. And we learned that right up here in this dialogue that the swineherd is telling him. And so the dog's been waiting for him almost 20 years. This is like the most emotional moment in the whole book, when they sort of have this moment of recognition. The dog either recognizes him by his scent or by his voice, lifts up its head. They sort of, recognize each other. The dog is happy and it puts down its head and it dies. And it's this wonderful moment, but it's very hard to show that the dog goes from being almost dead to dead just with using pictures. And I didn't want to use third person narration because I wasn't using that anywhere else in the book. And I didn't want to use a really cartoony device like X's on the eyes or something like that, right? So because I wanted it, to maintain, I really wanted this emotional scene in the original to be as emotional in my version. So after I drew it about 10 different ways and like showed it to people, the way that actually ended up being the best was to add something that isn't in the original, which is that Athena comes down and lifts the dog's spirit away from its body. And so we get to have this kind of tender moment where she's looking down at the dog, and we sort of see what it would have looked like as a puppy when Odysseus left for Troy. And then the other thing that's powerful in comics is the silent panel. So if I had ended with this panel of her carrying the dog away, you would turn the page expecting that scene to continue. So the silent panel both gives you a kind of a moment for an emotional pause. I mean, all these panels are silent, which heightens the emotion, but this one where also nothing is really happening at the bottom creates this emotional pause, and also is sort of cues you that we're about to change to something else. So when you turn the page and we're in the hall with the rowdy suitors, it's not quite so jarring. The last example is at the very end. There's a fight. The suitors' parents come after Odysseus and they start fighting, and then Athena stops them. And I always forget how abruptly this epic ends. It literally ends by just saying that she stopped them. She said, "Call off this battle now." Odysseus yielded to her. His heart was glad. Both parties swore to terms of peace set by Athena, daughter of Zeus, who bears the storm cloud as a shield, though still she was in the form of a mentor. So it's a very strange note, really, to end this big action scene on. But what I found was if I sort of just drew it as a straight narrative, it was super abrupt. But if I really focused on this moment where he yields to her and his heart is glad, so I basically drew that out by giving Athena another line of dialogue here. She basically presents him with this choice, like, you're going to have to decide, you're going to have to put away your sword if you want to live in peace. And also, by the way, you still have to fulfill the prophecy of Tiresias. That's basically a reminder to the reader that there is something else that also is going to have to happen. But then this moment where he is introspective and he looks at his own hands and he throws down the sword, that is my way of showing that moment and kind of drawing that out and emphasizing that, so that then the part where she arbitrates the peace can just be done with a single wordless panel. And then I can basically just say at the end, in a kind of a fancy way, I say, here ends the story of Odysseus as it has been passed down since the age of gods and monsters. And then we have an image of the ore that he has to plant, which is the prophecy of Tiresias that she has just reminded us of. So those are some examples of how the kind of my thought process of how I change something from one medium to another, and sometimes have to kind of tinker with, how to create the same effect that I got when I read it in a new medium sometimes involves that kind of subtle change. And I will stop screen sharing. And
you should be able also now to turn on your camera so we can see your face.
Woohoo!
There you are.
There I am.
You really are here. Amazing. All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much for showing us that and taking us through a little bit of the process. Lex, you want to hop in there?
Sure, I can. I was going to say those are really great examples, Gareth, and your depiction of Argos, Odysseus's dog, is really heartbreaking. I mean, I've read the Odyssey a dozen times, and it's one of my favorites. And that's a gut-wrenching scene. But actually see it visually, to see him, his fur is matted and
Yeah.
he's decaying, and then you've got those puppy dog eyes, and it's really impactful.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really nice. And yeah, Jason, at the top of the session, you'd asked if Gareth and I had known each other, and we have been lucky enough to know Gareth for quite a while, because when I started my journey, he was one of the first people I reached out to, because he had already tackled the story of Beowulf, which is sort of my playground.
Mhm.
Do we have? Should I share what I was gonna? Let me see if I can find it. And I'll just
Yes, please
share.
do. And we can extend the time. I know we were supposed to end at 8:45, but depending on how time works for both of you, we can extend a little bit if we run over to allow
Yeah.
time for Q&A too.
Let me see if I can just find my screen. Okay, do you guys see that?
Yes,
Yep.
looks good.
Okay. So yes, this is fairly quick. For a lot of folks who might be watching, my primary work is a graphic novel series called Kid Beowulf. And for those who are not familiar with it, I just thought I'd just walk you through the general conceit. And I wanted to start with the immortal words of Woody Allen when he said, and so he said, just don't take any course where they make you read Beowulf. That is one of my favorite lines from Annie Hall. I was not able to actually take that advice because it was required reading in high school for me. This was the version that we read in AP English. It was by Burton Raffel. I think I'm the only student in the class who read it, and probably the only person who actually liked it. And it's not surprising since, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up reading Greek myths and Norse myths and legends of every stripe. So when I read those opening lines of Beowulf, and these are from the Burton Raffel translation, "Hear me, we've heard of Danish heroes, ancient kings, and the glory they cut for themselves, swinging mighty swords." Well, that just grabbed me, and I was in for the rest of that epic poem. And at that time, actually, as in high school, I was reading all these other great fantasy epics, Tolkien, Arthurian romances. The Dragonlance series got me. And so, when I came to Beowulf and I'm reading those original lines, something about the language of the epic poem really just kind of lit my brain on fire. I could see those serpents in the boiling lake and the fight between Beowulf and Grendel and the dragon and whatnot. So Beowulf, for me, it lived in that unique space, where history and legend and mythology all kind of converge. And I then went on to study classics in college, falling in love with Homer and Virgil. But Beowulf is never far behind. Years later, when I was coming up with my own story, something I wanted to play around with in comics, I came back to Beowulf, and I wanted to kind of build a story that was a little bit more accessible. And at the time, I was thinking of some of my favorite comics, Bone and Asterix, and I wanted to apply some of those storytelling techniques to Beowulf. I wanted to make Beowulf accessible, and instead of having folks like Woody Allen, my classmates, bemoan it. So that brings us to Kid Beowulf, and I'll be the first to admit I'm not the first to make comic adaptations. There have been many, and as we mentioned, Gareth has done a wonderful one. I highly recommend it. These are just a few others. They're all just different adaptations and retellings. These are mostly straight adaptations, save for DC's Beowulf the Dragon Slayer. And funny enough, I probably have more in common with that than the others, because the conceit for Kid Beowulf is that Beowulf and Grendel, instead of being arch enemies, are in fact 12-year-old twin brothers. And book one, which is the cover we're looking at here, explains that. And then it sets up their adventures across Europe and Asia, where they'll meet other heroes along the way. For instance, book two takes them to France, where they meet the characters from the Song of Roland. Book three is an adaptation of the Spanish epic El Cid. And the most recent book, book four, is all about the early history of Rome, where Beowulf and Grendel meet another pair of twins, Romulus and Remus. So if you can already tell, timelines don't necessarily exist. It's sort of every country the characters go to, they fall into that country's epic time. And it's very much a mythological mashup. And the idea is to just sort of fill it with action and adventure and make it fun for folks to read. And along the way, the sort of superstructure of the story is that Beowulf and Grendel are learning where they fit amongst all these heroes, all these different mythologies. And it follows Joseph Campbell's monomyth, the hero's journey, so to speak. And it basically goes full circle back to the original Beowulf. So The actual destiny of Beowulf and Grendel, their confrontation, is alluded to in all the stories, and the superstructure of the Kid Beowulf series is whether or not they'll embrace that destiny or fight against it. So I like to come back to the meat of the classical stories whenever I can. Does it work in the classroom? The three things I try to do when I'm making these stories and getting them to younger readers, three things I keep in mind is sort of invite them in with a very fun, accessible artwork, to engage them with a fun, thrilling adventure story, and then finally inspire them to investigate the source material. Basically, to kind of just create a conversation with these classics, get them inspired to dig in deep and sort of see all the different connections between the cultures and the characters and how they overlap and how those new stories can be developed. So, and from my interactions with kids, I think it's working. I hope it's working. It's a lot of fun to do, that's for sure. So that's just a little glimpse into what I do. And I'll stop the share and throw it back to Jason.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing wonderful work, insights into classrooms, insights into a little bit of how teachers can use these and sort of the engagement they create. When you were talking about the AP courses, Lex, I'm thinking about 20 young people that I know right now, and just the general reluctance to read, that thing of working with students and having maybe the one that really digs into a book and others that are kind of there hanging out with it and others that are reluctant. So with that in mind, we can spend a lot of time talking about the debate of graphic novels in the classroom, but what do you feel, and we can jump back to Gareth on this one if we want to tag back and forth, what do you feel like the graphic novel adds to rather than takes away from the reading experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing is that because you're delivering information in different channels, right? Instead of just text, you're getting the visuals in parallel. So they're multimodal. They engage more parts of the brain simultaneously. You can't really skim them the same way you can skim text. So in a way, it encourages a deeper read. They actually tend to have richer vocabulary. There was a study done a while ago that showed that they had, basically like the equivalent of a very sophisticated adult novel, much more sophisticated than a picture book or what we think of as being typical for a comic. But because of that visual support, that vocabulary is easier for a kid to assimilate. And for me, what that ultimately boils down to is that they're a really good equalizer. Suddenly a kid who struggles with reading can be fully part of the discussion, fully part of the understanding and analyzing that story. And engaging with its themes and its symbols, and they can literally see the symbols. They can literally go search for visual metaphors and things like that. So I think those are all like some of the super strong selling points for graphic novel adaptations and original graphic novels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would just add to that the visual shorthand in graphic novels. Just it's a heavy load for the artist, and I'm just thinking again of Gareth's work and the level of detail in the Odyssey and the Iliad. But when you're reading Homer, maybe you don't know what a hauberk is, or those what did those shields actually look like? So it really helps put the reader into that literary space and get a lot of those references that they may have missed just by dint of the kind of language that's being used. Yeah.
Absolutely, the power of language and the vocabulary. I feel like right now my students are reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I kind of wish there was a really good adaptation of that out, because you have the dialect, you have slightly older language published in 1937, and the visuals that can come along with some of that dialogue and some of those images that the author's creating. It's just a powerful way to get across background knowledge, to create engagement. And Gareth, some of the things you were saying about the artistic decisions you had to make in conveying ideas, like the power of the wordless panel, and making some of those choices, it makes me think about the potential for having students also make adaptations, sort of the way that you have kind of inspired each other. And then the level of thinking that goes into that kind of representational detail is just huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that it encourages, because I think comics are a very intuitive medium, and the fact that sort of reading it in that form encourages kids to want to do that, maybe more than reading prose encourages them to write prose. I don't know. But you know, trying to adapt something into the comics medium, I think is a fabulous exercise for understanding that source text. And so, you know, I highly encourage, you know, whether you're comparing a graphic novel and a prose version of the text, or whether you're just taking a prose text and having the kids try to do a scene in comics, like it's a fabulous way to get them to really dig in and try to understand what's going on in the text.
Yeah, they're actually more, I was just going to say, there are more similarities to within the classics and the comics. You know, again, when I think of Homer, I think of those epithets, you know, Achilles, the swift runner Achilles, the wily Odysseus, or the windy plains of Troy. And I mean, those automatically pop up an image in your head. And so when you can match that text with an image, I think it crystallizes that idea even more so.
Absolutely. And Gareth, you spoke a little bit to sort of the difficulty of negotiating that scene, in terms of bringing across the image of the dog and the sort of awakening. But any other parts of the process that are particularly challenging as you're working through?
Well, I mean, the biggest challenge right off the bat is always just the scope of these stories and trying to the amount of work that it takes to adapt them and trying to get them down into a reasonable length for a graphic novel. That's always the first challenge. And then, you know, yeah, for me, like I'm always really trying to kind of maintain the emotional notes of the original. And so that's where a lot of the challenges come in, because sometimes things change when you change them from one medium to another. You know, certain things hit harder or don't land as well. So that's where, you know, it takes some finesse. But yeah, I just, for me, those problems are both more interesting and more suited to my nature than inventing stories. And I will say, just on that topic, you know, adapting kind of gets you around writer's block. So that's another reason to have kids do it, because it unparalyzes them if they're dealing with writer's block.
Yeah, you have an anchor. That's how I always feel about, even though I'm doing, you know, adaptations, and in some cases, you know, on the face of it, going far afield of the original text, at least I have that original text that I can fall back on. If there's ever a moment of writer's block, I can open up whatever translation it is I'm working with, and usually that original will reveal the way out. Yeah, and another important component is trying to, even though mine, I would say, sort of fall in the, you know, the action adventure fun component, but there is, it's always important for me to sort of get at that emotional core of what that original epic is all about, and try and feed that in somehow, subtext or whatnot, through character relationships in the new book that I'm doing. But Gareth is right. It takes so much energy to do these graphic novels, these comic books. It's just like, it's tough, but it is rewarding when you can actually, you know, get 200 pages done and deliver it and have somebody read it in a half hour and then ask you for the next one.
I'm also just going to say, I think that having the two of us on this panel together is a really good illustration of how you can be very faithful to the original story, but you can also use it as all kinds of inspiration and anything in between, so you can do mashups, you can do adaptations that transpose into a different culture or time period or whatever. And all of those things I think are fun for, makes it more fun for kids to engage that story if they think about, well, how would this play out, in science fiction, interplanetary, whatever, it has endless possibilities.
Yeah, and actually that reminds me. I'm sorry, Jason. I was going to say it
No, you're
reminds me
good.
of,
You're good.
of the page that you shared, Gareth, about Eurycleia and Odysseus' scar. Like that story. The next book I'm dealing with is going to be the Odyssey, and so there will be obviously a young Odysseus, and I wanted to actually do that story of him getting the scar, and
Perfect.
Argos would be, of course, a young pup, and so it's fun to see how other artists tackle that adaptation, the storytelling problems that you've solved really elegantly in not doing a full-on flashback. But then just as a creator myself, it just generates more ideas for where to go, and so yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, by all means, jump in anytime. My goal is to kind of fade into the background. So if you want to talk to one another, that's right. I'll just fade into the comics. And thinking about that merging of stories, the creativity, the revisioning of character, like just thinking about looking at the work that both of you have done, really leads me to that thought about inspiration and the ways that like an interpretation comes across for a student, and just some of the differences there in what a reader takes away that might be slightly different from another reader, and the ways that you kind of solve some of those storytelling problems through the work that you do, through humor, through image, whatever it happens to be. So in terms of classroom steps, in terms of the things that you're hoping that teachers are out there doing, I mean, I've got a couple of pieces that I can bring to that, but anything that comes to mind, as I know a good number of the audience is likely teaching.
So I'm just going to say Ronell Whitaker is in the audience, and Ronell and I have done a presentation together about some fabulous ways that he uses my books in the classroom. Look his stuff up, his social media. But there's a lot of opportunity to basically have students try to parse both the text and the images for things like characterization. How do the images convey the characters? And I mentioned visual symbolism, looking for those maybe visual metaphors or symbols. Having them kind of sort of parse the if you can compare the original to the graphic novel and try to have them actually analyze the decisions that the artist made. All that kind of stuff I think is really super good way to get them to dig into the text with the graphic novel.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, reading with pictures actually did a teacher's guide for my most recent book, and they did a great job. And when I got the text for it, Jenna had actually written it, and she picked up on a lot of things that I didn't even know I was doing in the text. So it made me seem a lot smarter, which I loved. And that's the great thing about working with teachers and educators who get comics and understand how important they are in the classroom, because I can speak for myself as a creator. They're just things that I'm not really, I think, intentionally putting in the story, but somehow it's getting in there, and that's what the teacher can see is a gateway to get to that kid, or to generate discussion in the classroom. So it's been fun to get those teachers guides back and actually learn a little bit more about the thing that I had written.
Yeah, that's also a really good point, is that for almost any graphic novel that you want to teach, there may be a teacher guide out there. There definitely are teacher guides for some of my books. And also Reading with Pictures has also done a lot of just good materials about how to use graphic novels in the classroom. And there's a lot of other people who have written smart stuff about that as well. So if you're really stuck, go searching for some of those guides.
Lex, the other piece from what you were sharing in the images, I noticed that students were writing back and forth with you, kind of the connection that you can make with students in that way. I just can't even imagine the power that it would have had for me as a young reader to, reach out, connect with a graphic novelist that I admired. So major digital applause to you both for connecting with readers in that way as well.
It's a real thrill to get any, to meet a fan at a show. And then I love that interaction with my young readers because, they're looking, again, sort of the way the teachers are looking at my text and finding avenues I didn't know were there. The kid is reading it too, and picking up on things that maybe they wanted to see more of, or perhaps something I missed. So it's sort of that sticks with me, like, oh, how can I do this better? How could I communicate this story more clearly? So that's invaluable. Just talking to your readership and seeing what resonated, what didn't, how can you improve? That's one of the best takeaways for me as a creator when I'm able to go to schools or conferences.
I'll give 2 shout outs to some comments. So we have Tracy Edmonds saying the teacher guide for Lex's book can be downloaded from the session listing, just in case you're looking for that. And Christopher Priest, the host, is saying also that he's doing some work on research supporting the use of visuals and text, or I'm sorry, on comics as they stand alone. So that's another thought to kind of explore if you're watching this, the use of comics paired up, but also the power of a comic or a graphic novel on its own as a complex text. And there are people out there that are examining the complexities of these books, thinking about reading with A Wrinkle in Time and creating images with that, and then comparing that with the adaptation that came later. So there are those comparisons that happen, but they're pretty complex on their own. And I'm always impressed with the complexity of the process of making these books. They don't seem to just come together quickly from when I talk to creators.
No, I don't know. I think I know a little bit of Garrett's process. Mine's fairly old school in the sense that I write a script and I draw everything on paper and pencil and ink, and then eventually gets to the computer for the finishing touches of color and lettering and whatnot. But every single stage brings its own problems, its own challenges, and it just to do them. As I said before, it's sort of a marathon challenge. And so some of my friends who are doing like a book a year, I salute them because it's just, there's so many storytelling challenges you're trying to fix, in whatever stage you're in. And I was going to say, Gareth, you are you still using? Is it InDesign that you're?
Yeah.
Which seems insane to me, but you've done it.
I'm one of very few people I think that you will meet that uses Adobe InDesign for my rough sketches of my book. I sketched the entire book out in InDesign using the freehand pencil tool, which is really not what it was ever meant for. But that's really my one innovation that's worked. I'm constantly tinkering with the process and trying to find ways to make it easier, and it's just never easy. There's no way to make it easy. It's hard.
Yeah, and the worst part, I don't know if that happens to you, Gareth, but if I finish a story and I'm starting a new one, it's like I've forgotten how to draw. Like I have to which I guess is why, smarter artists than me are constantly drawing all the time, because you're keeping that tool fresh. But yeah, it's like I got to start all over again. And it's like it's a perhaps a safety net for my brain, because it's so agonizing to produce a book that I have to forget I did it.
So. Yeah. It's like at the end of a book, I'm always torn between I want to keep the momentum going and jump right into the next one, but also I need a rest,
So we'll take some questions from the audience here in just a minute. If anyone out there has anything that they want to throw in as we're coming to the latter part of our time together.
Can I ask a nerdy question for Gareth?
By all means.
You're tackling the Aeneid now. Is that correct? Okay. And I was
Yeah.
just struck by how you ended the Odyssey, how you shared it with us. You know, that very abrupt ending in the epic, and how you're able
Mhm.
to actually give it a denouement. Like, I think the Aeneid, doesn't it end similarly? And if you have thought about how you're going to
Yeah, they
tackle that
all end
problem?
abruptly.
Yeah.
I mean, I've thought a little bit abstractly about it, but it's going to really come down to brass tacks and, you know, paneling out and figuring out what is the moment there that I can extend or that I can hit harder. Because yeah, it's based, you know, like the Iliad ends with, oh, you know, that's how they buried Hector, breaker of horses, and the Aeneid basically ends with, oh, and then he killed Turnus. Like, it's not quite that abrupt, but pretty much. So yeah, I'm already thinking ahead a little bit about that, but I haven't solved that problem yet. And
Beautiful
also,
challenges.
I'm actually doing two books. So I'm doing the Aeneid in parallel with another book, which actually you kept bringing up the word marathon, and that was triggering me because I'm doing a book that's about the history of the marathon, going back to the Battle of Marathon. So that'll be more like a kind of a picture book, similar to the Gifts from the Gods book that I did. So I'm working on those in parallel. So the progress is a little bit slow, but
Wow.
You're
So-
tapping into. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say we're going to get some good classic stuff from you in
Yeah.
the years to come.
staying in Greece for a while and Italy.
I love that both of you have written. I'll throw this out there for younger readers as well, because Lex, you have Hama as well, and
Yes.
just thinking about, you know, the audience for some of the books. So if you want to say anything about some of those works.
Yeah, in my graphic novel series, there's a little pig. His name is Hama the pig. He is Beowulf and Grendel's stalwart companion. And one of the things I noticed when I would go to comic conventions is younger readers, I would say 5 to 7 year olds, were really drawn to the graphic novels, but in some cases they weren't ready to read them. And so I didn't want to miss an opportunity, though, to not capture a reader. So I came up with a storybook that was just about Hama the pig, sort of the traditional 32-page story about, and it's sort of his origin story prior to him meeting Beowulf and Grendel. It's all about him wanting to be a Viking, as pigs do, you know. So, and that was a fun experiment, because I'd never really done a storybook before, and that had its own storytelling challenges, very different from the graphic novel. So yeah, it was fun to do that. I look forward to doing more of those sorts of stories. But anything to get, you know, a young reader engaged, I think most creators are game to do that. So
Anything to tag on there, Gareth, in terms of thinking this
Yeah.
is more geared toward high school, but also thinking about younger readers that maybe aren't quite ready for the full graphic novel yet.
Yeah, so I'm one of those authors who didn't really set out to write for kids. I wrote the book that I wanted to write, and then the publishing industry told me this is for teens, because that's when they're first encountering these works. But one of the things that's been really interesting, you know, first of all, by doing Gifts from the Gods, you know, I started to get some younger readers, and then it's amazing sometimes how young some kids will tackle something like the Odyssey or the Iliad if it's in graphic form. I hear all the time from people who are like, hey, my 6 and 8 year old are obsessed, you know, they've read the Iliad 12 times or whatever. This is not something I ever imagined I would hear. So it is, you know, obviously it takes a particular kind of kid to do that at that age, but I hear it more and more, and it's cool. It's astonishing. And I apologize to any of the teachers out there who are going to get those kids in your classroom and they already know the Iliad and the Odyssey forward and backward. And that might be an issue for you. I don't know, but
I'm always impressed. I mean, when a student comes in and they know something, how did you know that? And bonus points if you say a graphic novel. I mean, bonus points in class anytime. So we do have a few questions that have trickled in that I'll share with you, and we'll share any other questions that come in as well. And I know we're getting to our time, so if either of you need to go, I want to also honor that. But Tracy is asking, what kinds of questions do kids ask you when you do author visits? And I'll just give a shout out to author visits as well, because what a wonderful way to connect with a book and a story.
They ask everything.
Yeah, and the things, and in some cases you can't even, you've never heard the question, and it totally, throws you for a loop, because generally you think you know all the answers, but no, there's always some very smart kid who has done a very careful reading and wants to know what happened between panels 6 and 8 that triggered that question. For me, a lot of times I will, because in my presentations I often show the world map, which is sort of, for me, where the places hopefully I can take Beowulf and Grendel on. And in some cases, it's my stuff at this point is very Euro-Asian centric. And I recall doing a presentation for a class here in the Bay Area, and there were a lot of young Latino Hispanic kids, and I realized, oh my gosh, this is an audience I'm not serving, because there's a whole other part of the world. And so that was interesting, because they were asking, oh, well, will they ever come to the States? And that of course leads to places like Mexico and meeting the Aztecs and all this stuff. And so it's that getting to the opportunity to speak to a readership who can already kind of tell where you need to go next, and them sort of prodding you is really important. And so yeah, in that respect, those kids' questions really opened up my own world, and sort of forced me to evaluate and do my work better. So I always relish the opportunity to get those kinds of questions, and hopefully give them an answer, like that's satisfying for them.
One thing that I'll say that comes up again and again is the sort of like, what inspired you to do what you do question. And it's even after I've done my presentation, essentially I've tried to answer that question, but it's like that nature of inspiration is so hard to grasp, that they really want to understand that. And that's it's a slippery one, but I do my best to try to explain how that inspiration happens, because it is so important.
Absolutely. And Lex, your comment about students who are bilingual really resonates with me too, because I'll put graphic novels out. That's the thing that I do in the classroom. Just kind of put the books out there, see who gravitates. And some of my students who are bilingual this year were the first students to gravitate. So just thinking about the linguistic affordances of the words, the pictures, and all of those things coming together for the reader who's striving, the reader who's working across languages. And Gareth, your point about the reader who already knows the Iliad, by the time they get to you, there's a huge audience. So we have a question from Christopher. Have either of you all tackled making a science comic?
I can easily say no, I have not. That is not my forte. But I have a lot of colleagues who've done the science, and I applaud them for it. So I'm not smart enough to make a science comic. So
there's so many great science comics. I have not really done a science comic. I've done a lot of like illustrations for sciencey things. So just to give one example, I worked in the video game industry for a number of years, and I worked on a flight simulator, and in the user manual, we tried to explain aerodynamics. So I did all these illustrations of, sort of how aerodynamics works, and how different aerial maneuvers work, and the control surfaces and all that kind of stuff. So that would be an example of something that's sort of adjacent, but I have definitely never done like a full-on science comic like somebody like Jay Hustler or Maris Wicks, or there's Jim Taviani. There's some great people out there who explain science through comics.
Yeah, and I think
shout out. Oh, sorry.
First Second is doing an entire line of science focused graphic novels. Yeah, those are really some good stuff.
I was going to give a shout out to the Imitation Game comic that Jim Taviani has done, which is just great. And science comics from First Second, history comics from First Second. If you can read about it, it's probably in a comic, or it should be. classic philosophy in comics.
Yep.
And one of the questions we set out to answer, these are my essential questions being an educator. One of the questions was, what standards can you address? I hate to say standards covered because you never cover a standard, but so far I haven't found any standards, informational, reading, literature that aren't addressed in some way through a comic and graphic novel. And if anything, there are standards that it's almost impossible to address without using a comic and graphic novel, thinking about those media representations and the ways that students can think across media. So I wanted to make sure we answered that before we were at the end of our time together. But any other questions from folks out there, or any other comments that either of you want to make in case folks want to find out more about your work and how they can use it in their classrooms?
Well, I would just reiterate, if you wanted to learn more about my stuff, kidbeowulf.com is the place is the hub. And actually there I have a little tab called Teach. So that has information about author visits, whether virtual or in person, and actually all of the teacher guides for books 1 through 4 are free to download there. And also the books exist obviously in physical form, but they're also available at, I think, Comics Plus. Is it? It's, I forget the iteration of, there's an educator app, Epic. I know they live there, but they are out in the world in any format you may, or your students may want to read them. So
yeah, I'm at garethhines.com. That's a very clever idea to have a teach button. My teacher guides are located on the page for each of the books. So if you're teaching the Odyssey, you'll find a teacher guide on the Odyssey page. And my author visits stuff is on a separate page. And then I also have, there's links to my YouTube channel where I have a lot of process videos and things like, I have one where I go through the whole Shield of Achilles and sort of go panel by panel on the shield and read all those descriptions, stuff like that. So, check that stuff out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. And I don't think we have any more questions chiming in, but thanks for hanging on a few extra minutes with us. And thank you for being patient at the beginning as we were finding some different buttons and features and things like that. And hope to draw attention to your work in any way that we can. If you're looking for great comics to take to the classroom, these two folks, again, were the first people that I thought of when I was thinking about comics and adaptations, Gareth Hines and Alexis Fiardo. So thank you both. And there's some love coming in the chat as well.
Yay, thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.
thank you, Jason. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
So
great to talk to you both.
Oh, and if anybody's going to NCTE, I'll be there. So look for me there in Anaheim next month.
Anaheim.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I need to put that on my list and actually meet you in person.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
So much.